Set over a fire, the paste hardened into a flat bread that kept for several days. It did not take much of a leap to discover leavened, raised bread when yeast was accidentally introduced to the paste. Instead of waiting for fortuitous circumstances to leaven their bread, people found that they could save a piece of dough from a batch of bread to put into the next day's dough. This was the origin of sourdough, a process still used today. In Egypt, around 1000 BC, inquiring minds isolated yeast and were able to introduce the culture directly to their breads. Also, a new strain of wheat was developed that allowed for refined white bread. This was the first truly modern bread.
The idea of sourdough in general can be a little bit confusing to so many people because there are so many breads out there that are labeled sourdough, which actually aren't sourdough at all. For a long time, the idea of San Francisco sourdough was just this really sour tasting bread. It didn't have anything to do with natural fermentation. All they were doing was adding some kind of acid to make it this tangy product that people associated with San Francisco sourdough. The reality of it is that sourdough can be produced anywhere in the world with the bacteria and the yeasts and stuff in the sourdough starters. And sometimes the naturally leavened bread isn't specifically all that sour. It's a much more mild flavor depending on how much you're fermenting it. I started to develop this interest in the science of a sourdough culture. It was all trying to get back to what bread making has been for thousands of years. I think that sourdough starters was just the way to do bread up until yeast became commercialized. So what starter means to me and what starter is, you just take flour and water and you're creating a medium for these microorganisms that are in the air that we're breathing right now to colonize. They could take a little piece of that dough, mix that into a new dough, and that dough would start rising. The bacteria and yeast are doing their job, consuming the starch, producing gas for the bread to rise. And this is fermentation. It is a form of making food more nutritious and more digestible.
Bacterium. There's a difference between the yeast you find in typical supermarket bread and the yeast you find in sourdough bread. And supermarket bread, just typically made using baker's yeast or Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is able to consume the sugars in the dough for growth. That's different from the yeast you find in sourdough bread, the yeast being Candida milleri, and it's dependent on the bacteria you find in the bread, Lactobacillus sanfrancesensis, or San Francisco for short, to consume the sugar and spit part of it back out, and that's what allows the yeast to grow. This Lactobacillus species is really only found in sourdoughs, nowhere else. Like other lactic acid bacteria, produces organic acids as a result of its growth. This particular organism produces a lot of acetic acid, which is vinegar acid. That acid gives the bread a very sour taste.
How to make a sourdough starter, more appropriately called a natural levain or a natural yeast culture, because it doesn't have to be sour, and we'll talk about that in later or future videos. So you want to start by measuring out in a plastic or glass or non-reactive container 500 grams of filtered warm water, and you want to make sure that it's filtered, especially if your water contains chlorine or fluoride, both of which will inhibit and kill yeast growth. On top of that, you're going to measure out 250 grams of bread flour and 250 grams of whole wheat flour for a total ratio of 1:1 flour to water by weight. And you can go all whole wheat, you can go all bread flour. I prefer a 50-50 mix, and that's a personal preference of mine. Now you want to get your hands in there and mix this together, forming a thick batter. And some people will add fruit peels like apple skins, grapes, because that white haze that you see on the exterior fruits are naturally occurring yeast. But what happens is, unless you're getting it from your backyard or from a hyperlocal source, that you're still importing yeast into an environment, and your natural local yeast will have to do battle with that yeast. So I just prefer to use the natural yeast that's in the air and on the flour to inoculate my starter. You want to cover tightly with plastic wrap and make sure that you give your starter a name. because it is a living thing. So, hi, my name is Dave, and you want to talk to it and love it. And just like any living thing, you have to care for it and feed it. And you're going to place this in a warm spot in your kitchen and let it hang out for about 24 to 48 hours, as much as 72 hours. But it usually takes about 48 hours for it to look like this. And you see those little bubbles that are forming. Those bubbles are formed by the carbon dioxide that's given off by the yeast fermentation. So that's a good sign. That's showing you that you have a living active starter. Now at this point, it's time to feed and strengthen. So you want to take out half of your starter. We originally started with 500 grams of water and 500 grams of flour. So I'm going to take out 500 grams of the starter, and I'm going to add back in the same amount that I took out. So that will be 250 grams of flour total and 250 grams of warm filtered water. And again, I'm using half whole wheat flour and half bread flour, because that's a personal preference of mine. And we'll talk about this more in the lecture series, why you would feed certain flours to your starter. But for now, just suffice to say, it's a personal preference, and we'll get into that in more detail in Stella Culinary audio lectures in the future. So you want to use your wooden spoon to mix it into a batter again, making sure that you're combining the ingredients well. Cover it with plastic wrap, and then you're going to place it again in a warm spot in your kitchen and check it in another 24 hours. Now, it's important to get to know your starter because everyone's starter is different. So you want to feed your starter every 24 hours, preferably at the same time each day, for the next 3 to 5 days to really strengthen it and get it going. Now, notice how your starter smells right before and after feeding. It'll smell slightly acidic and have a little bit of alcohol before the feeding, and sweet and almost milky after the feeding. So here it is again after my initial 24 hours of taking out half and then feeding it. So I'm going to check the strength of my starter. And I'm going to do this by taking a spoonful of the starter and dropping it into some room temperature water to see if it floats. Now, if it sinks, like shown here, it's sinking to the bottom, I know that there's not enough carbon dioxide, there's not enough gas in there produced by the yeast to leaven a loaf of bread. So that's a good sign that my starter still needs more time. And you can look at it too. It's still fairly thin. As your starter becomes more active, even though it's the exact same hydration rate, it'll actually become thicker and more airy and more bouncy and full of life. Now, once the starter is active enough to pass the float test after 12 hours of fermentation, you're ready to bake your bread. You can start baking bread, or you can retard fermentation by taking out most of the starter and feeding it with cold water and flour and then placing it in your refrigerator, and this will slow down the fermentation process. Now, if retarding, you want to allow your starter to sit at room temp for an hour after feeding and then place in the refrigerator for up to 3 to 5 days between feedings. Now, your sourdough starter can be kept alive indefinitely if fed regularly and spoken to kindly. You do have to be nice to your starter. And how often you feed your starter depends on the appetite of your starter and how often you plan on baking sourdough or naturally leavened bread. If baking every day, you'll need to feed your starter once every 12 to 24 hours. Now, if you're going to be baking less often, like a few times a week or a few times a month, you want to take out most of the starter, feed it with cold water and flour, and store in your refrigerator, and then take it out and feed it every 3 to 5 days. Now, you'll need to refresh your starter at room temperature with 1 to 3 feedings before you bake it, and this is just to build that energy back up. Now, when in doubt, you want to make sure that it passes the float test. Now, we will have...
Currently, no genetically modified wheat is in commerce, and the commercial seed and grain supply does not contain genetically modified wheat. Even though the introduction of genetically modified wheat to North America was planned for 2004, the application for approval has been withdrawn. The United States and Canada are major exporters of wheat and will continue producing only conventional wheat cultivars. This will probably remain the case for some time, as tests on fungus-resistant GM wheat are still far from being completed. As of 2013, 34 field trials of GM wheat have taken place in Europe, and 419 have taken place in the U.S. Modifications tested include those to create resistance to herbicides, create resistance to insects, and to fungal pathogens and viruses, tolerance to drought and resistance to salinity and heat. increased and decreased content of gluten, improved nutrition, improved qualities for use as biofuel feedstock, production of drugs via farming, and yield increases. The regulation of genetic engineering concerns the approaches taken by governments to assess and manage the risks associated with the development and release of genetically modified crops. In 1997, Monsanto begins technical development stage of Roundup Ready wheat. In 1997 to 2003, field testing of Roundup Ready wheat conducted by Monsanto and academic researchers suggests an increased yield potential of 5 to 15%. In 2004, FDA issues biotechnology consultation note for Roundup Ready wheat. On May 10, 2004, Monsanto discontinues Roundup Ready wheat program and wheat research because of lack of commercial opportunities and its desire to refocus on other crops. In July 2010, BASF and Monsanto expand research and development collaboration, adding wheat to the biotechnology pipeline. In January 2011, the first biotech wheat project, a yield and stress trait, since Monsanto's re-entry into the wheat business enters Monsanto's R&D pipeline. In January 2013, herbicide-tolerant wheat project enters Phase 2 of Monsanto's pipeline. In May 2013, USDA reports it has detected the original Roundup Ready wheat trait in a single field on one farm in Oregon. Monsanto is cooperating with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to get to the bottom of the reported detection. It takes more than just flour to make bread. Many ingredients found in bread and baked goods are sometimes made with the help of genetic engineering. Several ingredients often found in baked goods are derived from soybeans, oils, lecithin and other emulsifiers, and even soy flour, which is sometimes mixed with wheat flour in small quantities due to its physical properties. The first genetically modified soybeans were planted in the United States in 1996. More than 10 years later, GM soybeans are planted in 9 countries covering more than 60 million hectares. These GM soybeans possess a gene that confers herbicide resistance. 85% of the total soybean crops in the U.S. are grams. GM soybeans are approved without restrictions and are treated just like conventional soybeans. Enzymes are often added to baked goods. They can make dough easier to process, make it expand, or provide for an ideal crust. Many of the enzymes used today are made with the help of genetically modified microorganisms. At this point, no baked goods are made with genetically modified baker's yeast. A few years ago, a genetically modified strain of baker's yeast was tested in Great Britain. This new strain had enhanced carbon dioxide production. It was hoped that it could help make bread rise more quickly, but in practice, the yeast was unsuccessful. Genetically modified yeast would have to be approved by the EU for use, and as of now, no applications have been submitted.
From the milling lab, we wanted to step next door to the baking lab here at the Food and Agricultural Products Center. We're joined by Renee Nelson, our milling and baking specialist, to kind of set up a demo and talk about the end product a little bit. And you've got a demonstration here with some different loaves of bread. Why don't you just start off in general, telling us what you have set up here?
Okay. I took 3 different types of flour. I took bread flour, all-purpose flour, and pastry flour. And I baked them the same exact way. I followed the AACC method, the cereal chemistry approved method. And you can see the difference in what the protein level has in the different flours. This was bread flour. It usually contains 10.5% higher, maybe to 12% protein. And all-purpose could be 9.5 up to 11. Maybe it would stop at 10.5%. A lot of the mills have their own little standards. And this would be pastry flour having less than 9% protein. And it shows that the more protein you have, the higher, the taller loaf, the more protein the flour has, the more it can hold the gases that the yeast produce. Where you can see where the pastry flour doesn't have a lot of protein, and so as it rose, it can't hold together and it just collapses and falls apart.
And obviously with this loaf, you know, there's some obviously differences right here in the top. And so
it kind of all relates to this gluten I've extracted out. So this was the gluten taken out of the bread flour. You can see how strong and stretchy it is, and that's indicative of having more protein. Where the all-purpose, there's still some stretch and strength, but just not quite as much as there is in the bread. And that's the one from the pastry flour. There's not a large quantity there, and you can tell by it's just not quite as strong. And that caused the holes in the top of the bread.
okay. Now looking at the individual slices that you've made from loaves of bread here, what did they tell you?
You want long, elongated cells, kind of lacy and elegant cells. That means that the bread could stretch and hold together. One doesn't want lots of little tiny holes and thicker cell walls. It makes for a different eating experience and different quality.